I never wanted to go camping in the canyon. I'm not an outdoorsy person. Give me a couch, Wi-Fi, and a bag of chips, and I'm good. But my best friend, Tony, had been bugging me for months to join him on a once-in-a-lifetime trip. It'll be fun, he'd said, grinning like a maniac. Just you, me, and the wilderness. At first, I said no. But Tony can be persuasive. He even guilt-tripped me about how we'd barely hung out since I got my new job. So, like an idiot, I agreed. I should have stayed home. The first day of the trip wasn't so bad. The weather was perfect, clear skies, cool breeze, and the hike down into the canyon was beautiful. Tony kept pointing out rock formations and fossils like some overexcited tour guide, while I just nodded and tried not to trip over the uneven ground. By the time we reached the campsite, the sun was starting to set. We found a nice spot near the river, surrounded by towering cliffs that turned orange and red in the fading light. "This place is amazing," Tony said, dropping his backpack with a thud. I had to admit, he was right. For a moment, I almost forgot how much I hated camping. Almost. The first night was peaceful. We sat by the fire, roasting hot dogs and telling stupid jokes until we were too tired to keep our eyes open. I slept surprisingly well, considering we were in the middle of nowhere. It wasn't until the next morning that things started to feel off. I woke up to find Tony crouched by the river, staring at something in the mud. "Hey," I called out, rubbing the sleep from my eyes. "What are you doing?" "Come look at this," he said, his voice strange. I stumbled over, still half asleep, and frowned when I saw what he was pointing at. It was a footprint. A huge footprint, embedded deep in the wet mud. "Is that a bear?" I asked, though I'd never seen a bear print that looked like this. Tony shook his head. "No way. Bears don't have claws like that." He was right. The print had 3 long, curved claw marks, each one as thick as my finger. "What do you think made it?" I asked, my stomach tightening. Tony grinned, his eyes lighting up with excitement. "Let's find out." I didn't want to follow the tracks. Every part of me was screaming to pack up and leave, but Tony was already heading up the riverbank, his camera slung over his shoulder. "Come on, man," he called back, waving me forward. "This could be huge." "Yeah, or it could be a mountain lion," I muttered, reluctantly following him. The tracks led us deeper into the canyon, winding along the river before veering off into a narrow gorge. The further we went, the darker it got, the sunlight barely reaching the bottom of the steep cliffs. "This is a bad idea," I said, my voice echoing off the rocks. Tony ignored me, crouching down to examine another print. "These are fresh," he said, grinning. "Fresh?" I repeated, my stomach twisting. "Yeah," he said, standing up. "Whatever made these, it's close." "Great." We followed the tracks for what felt like hours, the gorge growing narrower and darker with every step. The air felt heavier here, the silence oppressive. Even Tony seemed to be getting nervous, his usual chatter replaced by tense glances over his shoulder. "I think we should head back," I said, my voice low. "Just a little further," Tony said, though he didn't sound so sure anymore. That's when we heard it. A low, rumbling growl echoing through the gorge. We froze, our eyes locking. "What was that?" I whispered, my heart pounding. Tony didn't answer. The growl came again, louder this time, and I swear I felt the ground tremble beneath my feet. "Run," Tony said, his voice barely audible. We sprinted back the way we'd come, our footsteps echoing off the canyon walls. I could hear it behind us now, the sound of something massive moving through the gorge, its claws scraping against the rock. I didn't dare look back. We burst out of the gorge and onto the riverbank, gasping for air. "What the hell was that?" I shouted, doubling over. Tony didn't answer. He was staring back at the gorge, his face pale. I followed his gaze and felt my stomach drop. Something was standing in the shadows, just beyond the gorge. It was huge, its body covered in dark, scaly skin that shimmered in the fading light. Its head was long and narrow, with rows of razor-sharp teeth and glowing yellow eyes that seemed to pierce right through me. It let out a roar, its massive claws digging into the ground as it stepped forward. "Go!" Tony shouted, shoving me toward the campsite. We ran faster than I thought was possible, the creature's roars echoing behind us. By the time we reached the campsite, the sun was almost gone, the canyon shrouded in shadow. "We need to get out of here," I said, grabbing my backpack. Tony nodded, his face pale. "The trail's too far. We'll have to climb out." "Climb?" I repeated, my chest tightening. "It's our only chance," he said, pointing to the cliffs. I didn't argue. The climb was brutal. The rocks were loose and jagged, cutting into my hands as I scrambled up the cliff face. Behind us, the creature roared again, its glowing eyes visible in the darkness below. "Hurry!" Tony shouted, pulling himself onto a narrow ledge. I was halfway up when I felt the cliff tremble beneath me. I looked down and saw the creature clawing its way up the rocks, its massive body smashing into the cliff as it climbed. "Tony!" I shouted, my voice breaking. "Keep going," he yelled, reaching down to grab my arm. We reached the top just as the creature's claws scraped over the edge. Tony pulled me to my feet, and we ran without looking back, the sound of its roars fading into the distance. By the time we reached the car, the sun was rising, casting the canyon in shades of gold and red. We didn't talk as we drove away, the weight of what we'd seen pressing down on us like a heavy blanket. I haven't been camping since. But sometimes, late at night, I hear that growl again, low and rumbling, echoing through my mind. And I wonder if it's still out there, waiting for someone else to wander into its canyon. We should have turned back when we saw the bones. I still replay that moment over and over in my head, wondering what would have happened if we just turned around. Maybe Eric would still be alive. Maybe I wouldn't wake up every night, gasping for air, haunted by the things I saw in that forest. It started with Eric's obsession. He'd been talking about this place for weeks, a dense, untouched forest that he'd found marked on some obscure hiking map. "Come on, Lisa," he said, practically bouncing in his chair. "There's barely any info on it. It's completely remote. It'll be an adventure." I should have said no. But Eric had that way of convincing people, of making everything sound exciting, like the risk was worth it. It wasn't. We left early in the morning, driving for hours until the paved roads turned to dirt and the trees grew so thick they blocked out the sky. "You're gonna love this," Eric said, grinning as he grabbed his backpack. "I bet we'll see stuff no one's ever seen before." I rolled my eyes but followed him out of the car, my boots crunching against the gravel. The air was cool and damp, the forest alive with the sound of chirping birds and rustling leaves. It should have been peaceful. But something about it felt wrong. The trail was barely visible, just a faint path winding through the trees. "Are you sure we're going the right way?" I asked, stepping over a fallen branch. "Trust me," Eric said, pulling out his GPS. "I've got it all mapped out." We hiked for hours, the forest growing darker and quieter the deeper we went. By the time we reached the clearing, the sun was starting to set, casting long shadows across the ground. "We'll camp here," Eric said, dropping his backpack. I wasn't thrilled about spending the night in the middle of nowhere, but I didn't argue. We set up the tent, built a small fire, and ate dinner in relative silence. That's when we found the bones. Eric was the one who spotted them, half buried in the dirt near the edge of the clearing. "Check this out," he said, crouching down. I leaned over his shoulder, my stomach twisting when I saw what he was pointing at. It was a skull, long and narrow, with sharp teeth that glinted in the firelight. "What kind of animal is that?" I asked, my voice trembling. "I don't know," Eric said, his eyes wide with excitement. "But look at the size of it." He pulled more bones from the dirt, ribs, claws, and a long, curved tailbone. "This is insane," he said, grinning. "We have to take pictures." I wanted to leave. Every instinct in my body was screaming that we shouldn't be here. But Eric wouldn't listen. That night, I couldn't sleep. The tent felt too small, the forest too quiet. I lay there, staring at the fabric ceiling, listening for, I don't know, something. Around midnight, I heard it. A low, rumbling growl, so deep it made the ground vibrate beneath me. "Eric," I whispered, shaking his shoulder. He groaned, rolling over. "What? Did you hear that?" He frowned, rubbing his eyes. "Hear what?" The growl came again, louder this time. Eric sat up, his face pale. "What the hell is that?" We grabbed our flashlights and stepped outside, the cold air biting at our skin. The fire had burned down to embers, casting a faint orange glow across the clearing. "What do you think it was?" I whispered, my chest tight with fear. "Probably just a bear," Eric said, though his voice lacked its usual confidence. We scanned the tree line, our flashlights cutting through the darkness. That's when I saw it. Two glowing eyes, staring at us from the shadows. "Eric," I whispered, my voice trembling. "I see it," he said, his flashlight shaking in his hand. The eyes were huge, set wide apart, and they didn't blink. For a moment, everything was silent. Then, it stepped into the clearing. It was massive, easily the size of a bus, its body covered in rough, scaly skin that shimmered in the moonlight. Its head was long and narrow, with rows of razor-sharp teeth that gleamed as it let out a low, guttural growl. "What the hell is that?" I whispered, my heart racing. Eric didn't answer. We stood frozen, too terrified to move, as the creature sniffed the air, its glowing eyes locking onto us. "Don't move," Eric whispered, his voice barely audible. The creature let out a roar, so loud it made my ears ring, and took a step forward. "Run!" Eric shouted, grabbing my arm. We sprinted into the trees, the sound of the creature's footsteps shaking the ground behind us. I didn't dare look back. The forest was a blur of shadows and branches, the cold air burning my lungs as I ran. "Over here!" Eric shouted, pointing to a cluster of rocks. We ducked behind them, our chests heaving as we tried to catch our breath. The creature crashed through the trees, its massive body snapping branches like toothpicks. I clamped my hand over my mouth, trying to muffle my breathing as it sniffed the air, its glowing eyes scanning the darkness. For a moment, I thought it would leave. But then, it turned toward the rocks. Eric grabbed a large branch, holding it like a weapon as the creature stepped closer, its massive claws digging into the dirt. "Stay back," he shouted, his voice shaking. The creature roared, its jaws snapping as it lunged forward. Eric swung the branch, hitting it across the snout, but it barely flinched. "Go," he shouted, shoving me away. "Run." "No!" I screamed, tears streaming down my face. "Go," he shouted again, his voice breaking. I ran. I don't know how long I ran. The forest seemed endless, the trees blending together in a blur of shadows and moonlight. By the time I reached the car, the sun was starting to rise, casting the forest in shades of orange and gold. I waited for hours, hoping Eric would appear, but he never did. Eventually, I drove away, leaving him and the creature behind. I told the authorities what happened, but they didn't believe me. They said Eric must have gotten lost, that the forest was dangerous and full of predators. But I know what I saw. And I know it's still out there, waiting for someone else to stumble into its territory. I don't think I'll ever visit my uncle's ranch again. It used to be my favorite place in the world. Every summer, I'd spend a few weeks out there, helping him with chores, riding horses, and running wild across the open fields. It was a break from my boring life in the city, and Uncle Jim was the kind of guy who didn't ask too many questions as long as you didn't cause too much trouble. But last summer, something changed. Something I still can't explain. It started when Uncle Jim found the bones. I remember the first time he showed them to me. It was early in the morning, the sun just beginning to rise over the hills. I was helping him mend a section of broken fence when he waved me over, a strange look on his face. "You gotta see this," he said, pointing to a patch of dirt near the edge of the property. I followed him over, frowning as he crouched down and brushed away some loose soil with his hand. At first, I didn't know what I was looking at. The bone was huge, at least 3 feet long, with jagged edges and a strange curve that reminded me of a claw. "What kind of animal is that from?" I asked, my voice trembling. Uncle Jim shook his head. "I don't know," he said, his voice low. "But it's not like anything I've ever seen." We spent the rest of the morning digging. The more dirt we cleared, the more bones we found, ribs, vertebrae, and pieces of a skull with sharp, curved teeth that made my stomach twist. "This thing's gotta be prehistoric," Uncle Jim said, wiping the sweat from his brow. "Some kind of dinosaur, maybe." I laughed nervously. "Dinosaur? Seriously? You got a better explanation?" he asked, raising an eyebrow. I didn't. By the time we finished, we had unearthed what looked like an entire skeleton. It was massive, at least 20 feet long, with legs as thick as tree trunks and claws that could easily tear through flesh. Uncle Jim was grinning like a kid on Christmas morning, but I couldn't shake the feeling that we'd made a mistake. "We should call someone," I said, my voice trembling. "A scientist or a museum, maybe." But Uncle Jim shook his head. "No way," he said. "If we do that, they'll take it away. This is our find." I wanted to argue, but the look in his eyes stopped me. So I kept quiet. That night, I couldn't sleep. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, replaying the day's events over and over in my head. Around midnight, I heard it. A low, rumbling growl, so deep it made the windows rattle. I sat up, my heart pounding. "Uncle Jim?" I called out, my voice trembling. No response. The growl came again, louder this time, echoing through the still night air. I grabbed a flashlight and crept downstairs, my hands shaking as I opened the front door. The night was pitch black, the only light coming from the faint glow of the moon. But the growl didn't stop. It was coming from the field where we'd found the bones. I made my way across the yard, the beam of my flashlight cutting through the darkness. The air felt heavy, the silence oppressive. Even the crickets had gone quiet. When I reached the edge of the field, I stopped, my chest tightening as I shone the light across the dirt. The bones were gone. At first, I thought Uncle Jim had moved them. But as I stepped closer, I realized the ground was disturbed, like something had clawed its way out of the earth. My stomach twisted, and I stumbled back, my flashlight shaking in my hand. That's when I heard it. A loud, guttural roar that made my entire body freeze. I turned slowly, the beam of my flashlight sweeping across the field. And then I saw it. It was standing near the edge of the trees, its massive body silhouetted against the moonlight. At first, I thought it was a bear. But it wasn't a bear. It was too big, its body covered in rough, scaly skin that shimmered in the dim light. Its head was long and narrow, with rows of sharp teeth that gleamed as it opened its mouth to roar again. I stumbled back, my heart racing. "Uncle Jim!" I shouted, my voice breaking. The creature's glowing eyes locked onto mine, and it took a step forward, its massive claws sinking into the dirt. I turned and ran. I don't remember how I made it back to the house. The next thing I knew, I was slamming the door shut behind me, my chest heaving as I tried to catch my breath. "Uncle Jim!" I shouted again, my voice shaking. He burst into the room a moment later, his shotgun in hand. "What's going on?" he asked, his eyes wide. "There's something in the field," I said, my voice trembling. "Something huge." He didn't wait for an explanation. We made our way back to the field, the beam of his flashlight cutting through the darkness. The growling had stopped, but the air still felt heavy, like the entire world was holding its breath. When we reached the edge of the field, Uncle Jim stopped, his face pale. "What the hell?" he whispered. The ground was torn up, deep claw marks cutting through the dirt where the bones had been. And then we heard it. A loud, thunderous roar that shook the ground beneath our feet. We turned to see the creature charging toward us, its massive body moving with terrifying speed. "Run!" Uncle Jim shouted, raising his shotgun. I didn't need to be told twice. I sprinted back toward the house, the sound of the creature's footsteps shaking the ground behind me. When I reached the door, I turned to see Uncle Jim standing his ground, his shotgun aimed at the creature's chest. "Jim, no!" I screamed. The creature roared, lunging forward just as he pulled the trigger. The sound of the gunshot echoed through the night, followed by a deafening silence. And then, I ran inside and locked the door. The sun was rising by the time I worked up the courage to go back outside. The field was empty, the ground littered with deep claw marks and patches of blood. But Uncle Jim was gone. And so was the creature. I told the authorities what happened, but they didn't believe me. They said it was probably a mountain lion or a bear, that the bones must have been some kind of prank. But I know the truth. And I know it's still out there, waiting for someone else to disturb its grave. I didn't want to go back to the quarry. When I was a kid, my grandpa used to tell me stories about that place. He called it Cursed Land, a place where the rocks held secrets better left alone. I thought he was just trying to scare me. "You stay away from there, Timmy," he'd say, his voice low and serious. "There's things in that quarry that don't belong to this world." Of course, I didn't listen. What kid wouldn't be curious? My friends and I used to ride our bikes out there, daring each other to climb into the giant pit and look for fossils. But after what I saw last summer, I'll never go near that place again. It started when my cousin Jake called me out of the blue. "Tim, you're not gonna believe this," he said, his voice practically shaking with excitement. Jake worked for a construction company that had just bought the old quarry. They were clearing out the rubble, getting ready to build some kind of factory or warehouse. "They found something," Jake said. "Something big." "What are you talking about?" I asked, frowning. "Fossils, man," Jake said. "Like real dinosaur bones. You gotta come see this." I didn't want to go at first. The quarry gave me the creeps, even after all these years. But Jake wouldn't let it go. "Come on, Tim," he said. "When's the last time you saw something this cool? It's not like you're doing anything important." He wasn't wrong. My summer had been a total waste, just me sitting around the house, scrolling through my phone and wishing I had something to do. So I said yes. Biggest mistake of my life. The quarry hadn't changed much since I was a kid. The giant pit was still there, surrounded by crumbling rock walls and overgrown weeds. A rusty chain link fence circled the property, but someone had cut a hole in it big enough to drive a truck through. Jake was waiting for me near the entrance, his hard hat tipped back on his head and a grin plastered across his face. "Glad you made it," he said, clapping me on the shoulder. "You're not gonna believe this." He led me down into the pit, the rocky ground crunching under our boots. The air was cool and damp, with the faint smell of oil and machinery from the excavators parked nearby. And then I saw them. The bones. They were massive, half buried in the dirt and surrounded by construction equipment. "Pretty wild, huh?" Jake said, crouching down next to what looked like a giant ribcage. I nodded, my stomach twisting as I stared at the sharp, curved teeth of a skull that had been unearthed nearby. "What kind of dinosaur is that?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Jake shrugged. "No idea. Some paleontologists are supposed to come check it out next week. But until then..." He pulled out his phone and snapped a picture, grinning. "This is gonna make me famous." We spent the next hour wandering around the pit, looking at the bones and talking about how crazy it all was. Jake kept making jokes about Jurassic Park, but I couldn't shake the feeling that we shouldn't be there. The bones looked too fresh, like they'd been buried yesterday instead of millions of years ago. And there was something else. The ground around the bones was wet. Not just damp from the rain, but wet, like the earth was bleeding. "Doesn't this feel wrong to you?" I asked, glancing at Jake. "Wrong how?" he said, raising an eyebrow. "I don't know," I said, shaking my head. "It just feels off." Jake laughed. "You sound like Grandpa," he said. "Relax, man. They're just bones." I wanted to believe him. But deep down, I knew better. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about the bones, the sharp teeth, and the way the ground felt soft and wet beneath my feet. Around midnight, my phone buzzed. It was Jake. "Hey, you awake?" his text read. "Yeah," I replied. "What's up?" "Something's happening at the quarry." My stomach twisted as I typed out a reply. "What do you mean?" "Come see for yourself," he wrote. "Bring a flashlight." I should have said no. Every part of me was screaming to stay in bed, to pretend I hadn't seen the message. But Jake was my cousin. I couldn't just ignore him. So I grabbed my flashlight, pulled on my boots, and headed out the door. The drive to the quarry was eerie, the narrow dirt road lit only by the beams of my headlights. By the time I got there, my hands were shaking. Jake was waiting for me by the fence, his face pale in the moonlight. "What's going on?" I asked, my voice trembling. "Just listen," he said, holding up a hand. That's when I heard it. A low, rumbling growl, so deep it made the ground vibrate beneath my feet. "What the hell is that?" I whispered, my chest tightening. Jake shook his head. "I don't know," he said. "It started about an hour ago. I thought it was the equipment, but..." The growl came again, louder this time, and I swear I felt the air around me get colder. "Let's check it out," Jake said, his flashlight cutting through the darkness. I wanted to tell him no, to beg him to leave with me, but the look in his eyes stopped me. He wasn't going to back down. And I wasn't about to let him go alone. We made our way into the pit, the growling growing louder with every step. The air was thick and heavy, the faint smell of decay making my stomach turn. When we reached the bones, Jake stopped, his flashlight shaking in his hand. "Do you see that?" he whispered, pointing toward the far end of the pit. At first, I didn't. But then, something moved. It was massive, its body half hidden in the shadows. At first, I thought it was just a pile of rubble, but then it turned its head, and I saw its eyes, two glowing orbs that seemed to pierce right through me. "Jake," I whispered, my voice trembling. I see it, he said, his voice barely audible. The creature let out a roar, so loud it made my ears ring, and started moving toward us. "Run!" Jake shouted, grabbing my arm. We sprinted out of the pit, the sound of the creature's footsteps shaking the ground behind us. By the time we reached the car, my lungs were burning, and my legs felt like jelly. "What the hell was that?" I shouted, slamming the door shut. Jake didn't answer. He just stared at the pit, his face pale. "I don't think it's a dinosaur," he said finally. "What do you mean?" I asked, my chest tightening. He turned to look at me, his eyes filled with fear. "I think it's something worse." The next morning, the quarry was abandoned. The construction company pulled out, claiming the site was too dangerous to continue working on. They didn't give any details, but I knew the truth. Jake and I never talked about what happened that night. But sometimes, late at night, I hear the growling again. And I wonder if it's still out there, waiting for someone else to disturb its rest. When my dad got the job at the dig site, I thought it was going to be the most boring summer of my life. I was 16, and all I wanted to do was hang out with my friends, play video games, and sleep in until noon. But my dad was a paleontologist, and when he got called to supervise a big dig out in the middle of nowhere, he didn't give me a choice. "You're coming with me, Kevin," he said, loading boxes of equipment into the back of the truck. "It'll be a good learning experience." I wasn't so sure about that. The dig site was in the middle of a dry, dusty plain. There were no trees, no shade, and definitely no Wi-Fi. Just a cluster of tents, a few pieces of heavy machinery, and a lot of dirt. Dad was excited, though. He'd been talking about this place for weeks, saying it was one of the most promising finds of his career. "They've uncovered something incredible here," he said, his eyes shining. "A perfectly preserved dinosaur skeleton. Maybe even a new species." I didn't care. To me, it was just a bunch of old bones. But that changed when we found the nest. It was the second day of the dig, and I was helping one of the workers clear debris from a section of the site. The work was hot and exhausting, and I was just about to ask for a break when my shovel hit something hard. "Hey," I called out, wiping the sweat from my forehead. "I think I found something." Dad came running over, his face lighting up when he saw the smooth, round shape buried in the dirt. "It's an egg," he said, crouching down to examine it. "An egg?" I repeated, frowning. "Like a fossil?" Dad shook his head. "No. It's too intact. It's fresh." The egg was about the size of a basketball, with a rough, mottled surface that glinted faintly in the sunlight. "How is that possible?" one of the workers asked, her voice trembling. "If it's fresh, that means..." Dad didn't let her finish. "We need to move it," he said, his voice sharp. "Carefully." They spent the next hour digging it out, using brushes and tools to remove the dirt without damaging the shell. I just stood there, watching, my stomach twisting. Something about the egg didn't feel right. They moved the egg into one of the tents, setting it on a padded table under a bright lamp. Dad was buzzing with excitement, taking notes and snapping pictures while the rest of the team crowded around, whispering. "What do you think is inside it?" I asked, leaning against the edge of the table. Dad shrugged. "If it's what I think it is, this could be the find of the century. A dinosaur egg that's been preserved for millions of years, but somehow, it's still viable." "Viable?" I repeated. "Like, it could hatch." Dad smiled. "We'll see." That night, I couldn't sleep. The dig site was quiet, the only sounds the faint hum of the generator and the occasional rustle of the wind. But my mind kept going back to the egg. What if it did hatch? What if there was something alive in there? Around midnight, I got up and grabbed my flashlight, deciding to check on it. The tent was empty, the rest of the team asleep in their trailers. I pulled back the flap and stepped inside, the beam of my flashlight cutting through the darkness. The egg was still there, sitting under the lamp. But it wasn't still anymore. I froze, my heart pounding as I stared at the egg. It was moving, faint tremors shaking the table as cracks spidered across its surface. "Dad," I whispered, backing toward the entrance. "Dad, come here." The egg shook violently, a loud cracking sound filling the tent as a piece of the shell broke away. I stumbled outside, my flashlight shaking in my hand. "Dad!" I shouted, my voice breaking. He came running a moment later, his face pale. "What is it?" "The egg," I said, pointing toward the tent. "It's hatching." The rest of the team gathered around the tent, their faces a mix of excitement and fear. Dad stepped inside, motioning for the others to stay back. "Be careful," one of the workers said, her voice trembling. I stayed near the entrance, my chest tight with unease as Dad approached the table. The egg cracked again, a large piece falling away to reveal something inside, something dark and wet that moved. "Unbelievable," Dad whispered, leaning closer. The thing inside let out a low, guttural growl. "Dad," I said, my voice shaking. "Maybe you shouldn't." Before I could finish, the creature burst out of the egg. It was small, no bigger than a dog, with scaly skin and sharp claws that glinted in the lamplight. But its teeth were huge, too big for its tiny body, and they gleamed as it opened its mouth and let out a screech that made my blood run cold. Dad stumbled back, his eyes wide. It's a raptor," he said, his voice trembling. "A raptor?" I repeated, my chest tightening. The creature leapt off the table, landing on the ground with a thud. "Don't move," Dad said, his voice barely audible. But it was too late. The raptor lunged at one of the workers, its claws sinking into his leg as he screamed. The rest of the team scattered, shouting and scrambling for the exit. I grabbed Dad's arm, pulling him toward the door. "We have to go," I shouted. The raptor let out another screech, its glowing eyes locking onto us as it crouched low, ready to pounce. We ran. By the time we made it to the trailers, the screams had stopped. The night was eerily quiet, the only sound the wind rustling through the tents. "What do we do?" I asked, my hands shaking. Dad didn't answer. He was staring out the window, his face pale. "We have to call for help," he said finally. But before he could reach for the radio, something slammed into the side of the trailer. The raptor was bigger now. Its body had grown, its claws sharper, its teeth longer. It smashed through the window, its glowing eyes locking onto us as it screeched. Dad grabbed a wrench from the counter and swung it, hitting the raptor across the snout. "Run," he shouted, shoving me toward the door. I didn't hesitate. We spent the rest of the night running, the raptor's screeches echoing through the darkness. By the time the sun rose, the dig site was silent. The team was gone. The tents were torn apart, the equipment destroyed. But there was no sign of the raptor. The authorities didn't believe us when we told them what happened. They said it was probably a wild animal, that the egg must have been a fake. But I know what I saw. And I know it's still out there, growing, waiting for someone else to disturb it. I don't even know how to explain what happened. It wasn't supposed to be anything special, just a routine mapping expedition from my summer internship. I'm a geology student, and when my professor asked if I wanted to join a small team heading into an uncharted area of dense wilderness, I jumped at the chance. The idea was simple: study the terrain, take soil samples, and log any unique geological formations. The area was remote and surrounded by mountains, so it had barely been explored. Think of it as a lost world, Professor Hall had said, grinning. It'll be an adventure. He wasn't wrong. But it wasn't the kind of adventure anyone would have wanted. The first few days of the trip were normal. There were 5 of us on the team, Professor Hall, myself, 2 grad students named Maria and Liam, and a local guide named Ben. We hiked for hours through dense forest, crossing rivers and climbing steep hills. The work was exhausting, but the scenery was incredible, towering trees, crystal clear streams, and bright flowers unlike anything I'd ever seen. By the 3rd day, we'd reached the base of the mountains. That's when things started to feel off. It was Ben who first noticed something was wrong. He was leading the group, machete in hand, when he suddenly stopped and turned around, his face pale. "What's wrong?" Professor Hall asked. Ben didn't answer right away. He just stared at the trees ahead, his knuckles white as he gripped the machete. "This place," he said finally, his voice low. "It doesn't feel right." "What do you mean?" Liam asked, raising an eyebrow. Ben shook his head. "The jungle, it's too quiet. No birds, no insects. Nothing." He was right. The only sound was the faint rustle of the wind through the trees. "We should turn back," Ben said, his voice trembling. But Professor Hall just laughed. "Nonsense," he said, patting Ben on the shoulder. "We've come this far. Let's not let a little quiet scare us off." I should have spoken up then. I should have said something. But I didn't. We kept moving, the air growing heavier with every step. The trees here were massive, their gnarled roots twisting across the ground like veins. Moss clung to their trunks, and strange, claw-shaped vines hung down like ropes. It felt like we were being watched. "I don't like this," Maria whispered, glancing over her shoulder. "Relax," Liam said, though his voice lacked its usual confidence. "It's just a forest." But it didn't feel like just a forest. Around midday, we reached a clearing. The ground was covered in strange, circular indentations, like massive footprints pressed into the soil. "What the hell is that?" I asked, kneeling to get a closer look. Professor Hall frowned, brushing dirt away from one of the prints. "It looks like," he trailed off, his face pale. "Looks like what?" Maria asked, her voice shaking. "Dinosaur tracks," he said finally, his voice barely audible. We all laughed, thinking he was joking. But then Ben spoke. "We need to leave," he said, his voice sharp. "This is incredible," Hall said, ignoring him. "Do you know what this could mean? If there are tracks, there might be fossils nearby." Ben didn't look convinced. "These tracks aren't fossils," he said. "They're fresh." We camped in the clearing that night, even though Ben begged us to leave. "I'll stay up and keep watch," he said, gripping his machete. "Just promise me we'll head back in the morning." Professor Hall reluctantly agreed, but I could see the gleam of excitement in his eyes. He wasn't planning to leave anytime soon. As we sat around the campfire, the air grew colder, the flames flickering in the breeze. "It's probably just an old migratory route," Liam said, trying to lighten the mood. "Nothing to worry about." But none of us believed him. I woke up in the middle of the night to the sound of something heavy moving through the forest. At first, I thought I was dreaming. But then I heard it again, a deep, rumbling thud, like a giant's footsteps shaking the ground. I sat up, my chest tightening as I listened. "Do you hear that?" Maria whispered, her face pale. I nodded, grabbing my flashlight. The footsteps grew louder, the ground trembling beneath us. Then, I heard it, a low, guttural roar that made my blood run cold. Ben was already awake, his machete in hand. "Stay quiet," he hissed, motioning for us to stay low. The sound of snapping branches filled the air, followed by another deep roar. I shone my flashlight toward the trees, the beam cutting through the darkness. And then I saw it. It was massive, its body covered in rough, scaly skin that shimmered in the moonlight. Its head was long and narrow, with rows of sharp teeth that gleamed as it opened its mouth and let out another roar. A T-Rex? I whispered, my voice trembling. Professor Hall shook his head, his face pale. It's not possible, he muttered. It can't be. But it was. The creature stepped into the clearing, its glowing eyes locking onto us. For a moment, none of us moved, too terrified to even breathe. Then, Ben shouted, "Run!" We scattered, diving into the trees as the creature roared and charged toward us. I could hear its massive footsteps behind me, the ground shaking with every step. I didn't dare look back. I don't know how long I ran. The jungle was a blur of shadows and branches, the cold air burning my lungs as I stumbled through the undergrowth. When I finally stopped, I realized I was alone. "Hello?" I called out, my voice trembling. No response. The only sound was the faint rustle of the wind and the distant roar of the creature. I spent the rest of the night hiding in a hollow tree, too scared to move. When the sun finally rose, I ventured out, my legs shaking as I made my way back toward the clearing. The camp was destroyed. The tents were shredded, the fire pit overturned, and the ground littered with deep claw marks. But there was no sign of the others. A search team found me 3 days later, wandering near the edge of the forest. I told them what happened, but they didn't believe me. They said my team must have gotten lost, that the jungle was full of predators and hidden dangers. But I know what I saw. And I know it's still out there, somewhere in that jungle, waiting for someone else to stumble into its territory. I never wanted to go into the cave. It was supposed to be a simple camping trip, just me, my brother Luke, and his friend Jason. We'd planned it for months, 2 nights in the wilderness, hiking, fishing, and enjoying some time away from phones and work. We picked a spot in the middle of nowhere, near a series of cliffs that Luke swore were great for exploring. He was always the adventurous one, the kind of guy who couldn't sit still for 5 minutes without looking for something exciting to do. I should have known better than to let him talk me into it. The first day of the trip went fine. We parked the truck at the trailhead and hiked about 5 miles to a clearing near the cliffs. The forest was beautiful, tall trees, clear skies, and the faint sound of a river somewhere in the distance. "Perfect spot," Luke said, dropping his backpack with a grin. Jason nodded, already unpacking the tent. "Told you this would be worth it." I wasn't so sure. Something about the cliffs felt wrong. The way they loomed over the forest, casting long shadows even in the afternoon sun. It felt like they were watching us. But I didn't say anything. That night, we sat around the campfire, laughing and telling stories. Jason kept bringing up the cave, a small opening in the cliffs that we'd passed on the way to the clearing. "You know we have to check it out tomorrow," he said, grinning. "How often do you get a chance to explore something like that?" I shook my head. "Caves are dangerous. You don't know what's in there." "That's the fun part," Luke said, nudging me with his elbow. "Come on, Sam. Live a little." I wanted to say no, to tell them we should just stick to hiking and fishing. But Luke always had a way of convincing me. The next morning, we packed some gear and headed for the cave. The opening was small, barely big enough to squeeze through, but Luke and Jason didn't hesitate. They ducked inside, their flashlights cutting through the darkness, and motioned for me to follow. "Come on, Sam," Luke said. "It's just a cave." I took a deep breath and crawled in after them. The air inside was cool and damp, the walls rough and jagged. Our footsteps echoed as we moved deeper, the light from the entrance fading behind us. "This is amazing," Jason said, shining his flashlight along the ceiling. "Look at those stalactites." I wasn't paying attention to the rocks. I was too busy listening to the sound of something moving in the darkness ahead. At first, I thought it was just the sound of water dripping. But as we moved deeper into the cave, the sound grew louder, like the scrape of claws against stone. "Do you hear that?" I whispered, my voice trembling. Luke frowned, shining his flashlight into the shadows. "Probably just bats," he said. But it didn't sound like bats. It sounded bigger. The cave opened up into a massive chamber, the ceiling so high our flashlights couldn't reach it. In the center of the chamber was a pile of bones, hundreds of them, scattered across the floor like someone had been collecting them. "Whoa," Jason said, crouching down to pick up a skull. "This is insane. What kind of animal do you think this came from?" Luke shook his head, his face pale. "I don't know. But it's not a deer." The skull was massive, with long, curved teeth that glinted in the flashlight's beam. I took a step back, my chest tightening. "We shouldn't be here," I said. Luke didn't argue. We turned to head back, but the tunnel behind us was gone. The entrance we'd crawled through had vanished, replaced by solid rock. "What the hell?" Jason said, his voice rising. "This is where we came in, right?" Luke nodded, his flashlight shaking in his hand. "It has to be." The sound of claws scraping against stone echoed through the chamber, louder this time. I froze, my heart racing as I shone my flashlight toward the far end of the room. Something was moving in the shadows. It stepped into the light, and my stomach dropped. It was massive, its scaly body covered in jagged, dark green skin that shimmered in the flashlight's beam. Its head was long and narrow, with rows of sharp teeth that gleamed as it opened its mouth and let out a low, guttural growl. "What the hell is that?" Jason whispered, stumbling back. Luke didn't answer. The creature's glowing eyes locked onto us, and it took a step forward, its claws clicking against the stone floor. "Run," Luke said, his voice barely audible. We sprinted toward another tunnel, our flashlights bouncing wildly as we stumbled through the darkness. The creature's footsteps echoed behind us, the ground trembling with every step. I didn't dare look back. The tunnel twisted and turned, the walls narrowing until we had to duck and squeeze through gaps in the rock. "Keep going!" Luke shouted, his voice ragged. We burst into another chamber, this one smaller and darker than the first. But the creature didn't stop. It crashed through the tunnel, its glowing eyes locking onto us as it let out another roar. Jason grabbed a rock and hurled it at the creature, hitting it square in the snout. The creature roared, shaking its massive head, and Jason turned to us, his face pale. "Go!" he shouted. "I'll hold it off." "No!" Luke shouted, grabbing his arm. "We're not leaving you." But Jason shook his head. "You don't have a choice." He pushed Luke toward the tunnel and turned to face the creature, his flashlight shining directly into its eyes. "Come on, you bastard," he shouted. The creature roared and lunged at him. We ran. I don't know how long we ran, the tunnels blending together in a blur of shadows and jagged rocks. By the time we finally saw light, my legs felt like they were on fire, and my lungs were burning. We crawled out of the cave and collapsed on the ground, gasping for air. But Jason didn't come out. The authorities didn't believe us when we told them what happened. They said Jason must have gotten lost, that the cave was dangerous and full of hidden tunnels. But I know what I saw. And I know it's still in there, waiting for someone else to stumble into its lair. I didn't believe the rumors about the lake. For as long as I could remember, people in our small town talked about something strange living in the water. There were stories of missing fishermen, strange ripples, and eerie sounds at night. But everyone assumed it was just that, stories. I always thought it was a way for the locals to scare kids away from swimming too far or staying out too late. I didn't think much about it until the day my best friend Max asked me to join him on the lake for a fishing trip. "Come on, Katie," Max said, leaning against his truck. "The lake's been dead quiet for weeks. We'll have it all to ourselves." I frowned, crossing my arms. "Dead quiet, huh? That doesn't sound suspicious to you?" He laughed. "What, you think the lake monster's gonna eat us?" I rolled my eyes. "I think it's probably a waste of time. No one's been catching anything out there lately." Max shrugged. "Then we'll just hang out and relax. Bring a couple of beers, maybe a sandwich. What's the harm?" I sighed. I didn't really want to go, but I could never say no to Max. We set out early the next morning, loading up his old rowboat with fishing rods, a cooler, and some snacks. The lake was calm and quiet, the water like glass as we paddled out toward the middle. "See?" Max said, leaning back in his seat. "It's peaceful out here." I nodded, though I couldn't shake the uneasy feeling in my chest. Something about the lake felt wrong. We spent most of the morning casting our lines and chatting about nothing in particular. Max was his usual laid-back self, cracking jokes and making fun of my terrible casting technique. But as the day went on, the unease in my chest grew stronger. The lake was too quiet. There were no birds, no fish jumping, not even the sound of insects buzzing near the shore. "Doesn't this feel weird to you?" I asked, glancing at Max. He shrugged. "It's just a slow day. Nothing to worry about." But I wasn't so sure. Around noon, Max's line went taut. "Got something," he shouted, gripping the rod with both hands. I leaned over the edge of the boat, my heart pounding with excitement as he reeled it in. But instead of a fish, something else broke the surface. It was a bone. A long, jagged bone, with one end sharpened to a point like a spear. "What the hell?" I whispered, my stomach twisting. Max frowned, pulling the bone into the boat. "That's weird. We need to leave," I said, my voice trembling. But Max just laughed. "It's probably just a prank," he said, tossing the bone aside. "Someone messing with people." I didn't believe him. The wind picked up in the afternoon, rippling the surface of the lake and making the boat sway. Max was busy adjusting his line when I saw it, a shadow moving beneath the water. It was massive, long and sinuous, and it moved with a speed that made my stomach drop. "Max," I whispered, gripping the edge of the boat. "What?" he asked, not looking up. "There's something in the water," I said, my voice shaking. He frowned, glancing over the side. "Probably just a log," he said. But I knew it wasn't a log. The shadow circled the boat, sending ripples across the water. Max finally stood, his face pale as he stared at the dark shape beneath the surface. "That's not a log," he said, his voice trembling. I grabbed the oars, my hands shaking. "We need to get out of here." Before Max could respond, the shadow rose. It broke the surface with a deafening roar, water cascading off its massive body. At first, I couldn't process what I was seeing. It looked like something out of a nightmare, a creature with rough, scaly skin, a long neck, and a head full of razor-sharp teeth. "Max!" I screamed, clutching the oars. He froze, his eyes wide as the creature let out another roar, its glowing eyes locking onto us. "Row!" he shouted, grabbing one of the oars. We paddled as fast as we could, the boat lurching forward with every stroke. The creature dove beneath the water, its massive tail sending waves crashing against the sides of the boat. "Where is it?" I shouted, my voice breaking. "I don't know," Max yelled, glancing over his shoulder. The water was eerily still for a moment, and I thought maybe we'd escaped. But then the boat tipped. I hit the water hard, the cold shock stealing the breath from my lungs. When I surfaced, I saw Max clinging to the overturned boat, his face pale with terror. "Swim," he shouted, his voice hoarse. I turned and saw the creature charging toward us, its massive body cutting through the water like a torpedo. I kicked as hard as I could, my chest burning as I struggled to reach the shore. Max screamed, and I turned just in time to see the creature lunge at him, its massive jaws closing around the boat. I don't know how I made it to the shore. By the time I collapsed on the muddy bank, my arms and legs felt like they were made of lead. I turned back to the lake, but Max was gone. The authorities didn't believe me when I told them what happened. They said Max must have drowned, that the lake was dangerous and full of hidden currents. But I know what I saw. And I know it's still out there, waiting beneath the surface for someone else to venture too far into its territory. I didn't even want the job. The old mine had been shut down for years, but the company that bought it was hiring workers to survey the tunnels and see if it was worth reopening. My dad used to work there, back when it was still active, so I knew the stories. Cave-ins, gas leaks, strange disappearances. "It's cursed," my dad used to say, shaking his head. That place should have stayed buried. But I was broke. My car was falling apart, my rent was overdue, and I didn't have many options. So when my buddy Tom called and said the job paid double what most places offered, I said yes. Biggest mistake of my life. The first day at the mine was uneventful. The site was quiet, just a handful of workers and some old machinery that looked like it hadn't been touched in decades. The foreman, a gruff guy named Mitch, handed us hard hats and flashlights, gave us a quick safety lecture, and sent us down into the tunnels. Our job was simple: map out the mine, look for signs of structural damage, and report anything unusual. "What's the worst that could happen?" Tom said, grinning as we descended into the darkness. I should have known better. The tunnels were cramped and damp, the air thick with the smell of dirt and rust. We worked in pairs, with Tom and me assigned to the lower levels while the others stayed closer to the surface. The deeper we went, the colder it got. Our footsteps echoed off the walls, the sound swallowed by the oppressive silence of the mine. "This place gives me the creeps," I said, shining my flashlight across the jagged walls. Tom laughed. "Don't tell me you're scared already." I didn't answer. By lunchtime, we'd mapped out most of the lower tunnels. Tom was leaning against the wall, munching on a sandwich, when he spotted something in the dirt. "Hey, check this out," he said, crouching down. I frowned, stepping closer. At first, I thought it was just a rock, but as Tom brushed away the dirt, I realized it was something else. It was a bone. "What kind of animal do you think this came from?" Tom asked, holding it up to the light. I shook my head, my stomach twisting. "I don't know, but it's huge." The bone was long and curved, with jagged edges that looked like they'd been chewed. "This is wild," Tom said, grinning. "We should show Mitch." But I didn't want to. Something about the bone felt wrong. We found more bones as we kept digging. Some were small, like ribs or vertebrae, but others were massive, skulls with sharp teeth, claws that looked like they could tear through steel. Tom was thrilled, snapping pictures and cracking jokes, but I couldn't shake the feeling that we were trespassing. "We shouldn't be here," I said, glancing over my shoulder. "Relax," Tom said, waving me off. "It's just a bunch of old bones." But they didn't look old. That night, I couldn't sleep. We were staying in a small trailer near the mine, and every time I closed my eyes, I saw the bones. Around midnight, I heard something. At first, I thought it was just the wind, but as I sat up, I realized it was coming from the direction of the mine. It was a low, rumbling sound, like the growl of a massive animal. "Tom," I whispered, shaking his shoulder. He groaned, rolling over. "What? Do you hear that?" He sat up, rubbing his eyes. "Hear what?" The growl came again, louder this time. Tom frowned, grabbing his flashlight. "Let's check it out." I didn't want to go, but I wasn't about to let Tom go alone. We grabbed our flashlights and headed toward the mine, the cold night air biting at our skin. The growling grew louder as we approached, echoing through the tunnels like the roar of a distant storm. "This is a bad idea," I said, my voice trembling. Tom just grinned. "Come on, scaredy cat. It's probably just some kind of animal." But it didn't sound like an animal. It sounded bigger. We made our way down into the lower tunnels, the growling growing louder with every step. The air was freezing now, our breath visible in the beams of our flashlights. When we reached the spot where we'd found the bones, Tom stopped, his flashlight shaking in his hand. "What the hell is that?" he whispered. I followed his gaze and felt my stomach drop. There was something moving in the shadows. It stepped into the light, and my blood ran cold. It was massive, its body covered in rough, scaly skin that shimmered in the faint glow of our flashlights. Its head was long and narrow, with rows of sharp teeth that gleamed as it opened its mouth and let out another growl. "A dinosaur?" Tom whispered, his voice barely audible. I couldn't speak. The creature's glowing eyes locked onto us, and it took a step forward, its claws scraping against the stone floor. "Run," I whispered. Tom didn't need to be told twice. We sprinted through the tunnels, the sound of the creature's footsteps shaking the ground behind us. The walls seemed to close in around us, the darkness pressing down as we stumbled over rocks and debris. "Where's the exit?" Tom shouted, his voice echoing. "I don't know," I yelled, my chest tight with panic. The creature roared, the sound so loud it made my ears ring. I turned and saw its massive jaws snapping just a few feet behind us. "Go!" Tom shouted, shoving me forward. We burst out of the mine and into the cold night air, collapsing on the ground. The growling stopped, and for a moment, everything was silent. Then, we heard it. The sound of something massive moving through the trees. "It's coming," I whispered, my voice trembling. Tom grabbed my arm, pulling me to my feet. "We have to get to the truck." We ran as fast as we could, the creature's footsteps growing louder behind us. When we finally reached the truck, Tom jumped into the driver's seat and started the engine, the headlights cutting through the darkness. The creature roared, its massive body crashing through the trees as it charged toward us. "Go!" I shouted, slamming the door. Tom floored the gas, the truck lurching forward as the creature swiped at us, its claws scraping against the rear bumper. We didn't stop until we were miles away. The company shut down the site the next day. They said it was due to structural instability, but Tom and I knew the truth. We never went back. But sometimes, late at night, I hear the growling again. And I wonder if it's still down there, waiting for someone else to disturb it. The island wasn't supposed to exist. I'd been on plenty of fishing trips before, but this one was different. My cousin Danny had chartered a small boat for the weekend, planning to explore some remote spots he'd read about in an old fishing guide. "It'll be great, Jack," he'd said, grinning as he packed the cooler. "Big fish, no crowds. Just us and the ocean." I'd agreed, mostly because I didn't have anything better to do. But by the end of the trip, I'd be wishing I'd stayed home. We left the dock early Saturday morning, the boat cutting through the waves as the sun rose behind us. Danny was in high spirits, humming along to the crackly radio as he steered us toward open water. The guidebook he'd found was ancient, its pages yellowed and torn, but he swore it had the best fishing spots marked out. "This is gonna be epic," he said, tapping the map. "No one's fished these waters in years." I wasn't so sure. The first day was uneventful. We spent hours drifting from spot to spot, casting our lines and catching nothing but seaweed. By the time the sun started to set, Danny was frustrated, muttering under his breath as he checked the map again. "That's weird," he said, frowning. "What is?" I asked, leaning over his shoulder. "There's supposed to be an island around here," he said, pointing to a spot on the map. "But I don't see anything." I shrugged. "Maybe the map's wrong. It's pretty old." But Danny wasn't convinced. We dropped anchor for the night, planning to try again in the morning. The ocean was calm, the stars bright above us as we ate dinner on the deck. Danny was still fixated on the map, tracing the lines with his finger and muttering to himself. "It's gotta be here," he said, tapping the paper. "It's too big to miss." I rolled my eyes. "Maybe it sank." He didn't laugh. I woke up in the middle of the night to the sound of waves crashing against the hull. At first, I thought it was just the tide, but as I sat up, I realized the boat wasn't moving. "Danny?" I called out, climbing out of the cabin. He was standing at the bow, staring at something in the distance. "What is it?" I asked, rubbing the sleep from my eyes. He pointed. I turned and felt my stomach drop. There was an island. It wasn't there when we'd anchored, I was sure of it. But now, less than a mile away, a dark mass rose out of the water, its jagged cliffs glowing faintly in the moonlight. "Where did that come from?" I whispered, my chest tightening. Danny grinned, his excitement back in full force. "I told you it was here." "This doesn't make sense," I said, shaking my head. "It wasn't on the horizon earlier. How does an island just appear?" "Who cares?" Danny said, grabbing his fishing rod. "We're checking it out." I wanted to argue, but I knew it was pointless. We reached the island just as the sun was rising, the light revealing a rocky shore covered in strange, white stones. Danny was the first to jump out of the boat, his boots crunching against the rocks as he pulled our gear onto the beach. "Look at this place," he said, grinning. "Untouched. No wonder it's not on any modern maps." I stepped onto the shore, my stomach twisting as I looked around. The stones weren't stones. They were bones. "Danny," I said, my voice trembling. "We shouldn't be here." He laughed, waving me off. "Relax, Jack. They're just animal bones. Probably whales or something." I wasn't so sure. Some of the bones were massive, skulls the size of boulders, with long, sharp teeth that didn't belong to any animal I'd ever seen. The air was heavy, the only sound the distant crash of waves against the cliffs. "I'm serious," I said, grabbing his arm. "Let's go back to the boat." Danny sighed, shaking me off. "Come on, man. Don't be such a baby. We'll just look around for a bit, then we'll leave." I didn't have a choice. We hiked inland, the rocky terrain giving way to dense jungle. The air was hot and humid, the ground littered with more bones, ribs, claws, and vertebrae that looked like they belonged in a museum. "This is insane," Danny said, snapping pictures with his phone. "We're the first people to see this in who knows how long." I didn't respond. My chest was tight, every instinct screaming at me to turn around. Then we heard it. A low, rumbling growl echoing through the trees. "What was that?" I whispered, my heart pounding. Danny frowned, his grip tightening on his fishing rod. Probably just the wind. But it didn't sound like the wind. The growl came again, louder this time, followed by the sound of something crashing through the underbrush. "Run," I said, grabbing his arm. But before we could move, it stepped into the clearing. It was massive, its scaly body covered in dark green skin that shimmered in the sunlight. Its head was long and narrow, with rows of razor-sharp teeth that glinted as it opened its mouth and let out a deafening roar. "A dinosaur?" Danny whispered, his voice barely audible. I couldn't speak. The creature's glowing eyes locked onto us, and it crouched low, its massive claws digging into the dirt. "Move!" I shouted, shoving Danny toward the trees. We sprinted through the jungle, the creature's roars echoing behind us. The ground shook with every step it took, branches snapping like twigs as it barreled through the underbrush. "This way!" Danny shouted, leading us toward the cliffs. I didn't know where he was going, but I followed, my chest burning as I struggled to keep up. When we broke through the tree line, I realized his plan. The boat was just below us, anchored near the rocky shore. "We can jump," Danny said, his voice ragged. "You're crazy," I shouted. But the creature roared again, and I didn't have a choice. The fall was a blur of wind and water, the impact knocking the air from my lungs. I surfaced, gasping, and turned to see Danny climbing onto the boat. "Come on," he shouted, reaching out a hand. I swam as fast as I could, the creature's roars growing fainter as it paced along the cliff above us. When I finally reached the boat, Danny hauled me aboard, and we didn't waste a second. He started the engine, and we sped away, the island growing smaller behind us. We didn't speak on the ride back, both of us too shaken to process what had happened. When we reached the dock, Danny turned to me, his face pale. "We don't tell anyone about this," he said. I nodded. But sometimes, late at night, I see that island in my dreams. And I know it's still out there, waiting for someone else to find it. It started as a normal road trip. My girlfriend, Rachel, and I were driving through the middle of nowhere, headed to a music festival a few states over. We'd planned the trip for months, mapping out all the stops, booking cheap motels, and loading up on snacks. The first 2 days were perfect. Sunny skies, good music, and nothing but open road. But by the third day, things started to go wrong. The highway we were on was practically deserted, just miles and miles of empty road surrounded by dry, rocky plains. "I think we're lost," Rachel said, frowning at the map. I glanced at the GPS on my phone. The signal was weak, the little blue dot spinning aimlessly. "We'll figure it out," I said, trying to sound confident. But deep down, I had a bad feeling. We kept driving, hoping to find a gas station or a sign pointing us in the right direction. But the further we went, the emptier the highway got. No cars, no buildings, no people. Just the same endless stretch of road and the occasional tumbleweed rolling by. "This is weird," Rachel said, leaning forward in her seat. "Where is everyone?" I didn't have an answer. We finally spotted something on the horizon, a small, rusted sign leaning at an awkward angle. "Thank God," Rachel said, squinting to read it as we got closer. The sign was old and faded, the letters barely visible. It pointed toward a dirt road that veered off the highway, with the words "Scenic Route" written underneath. Rachel looked at me, raising an eyebrow. "What do you think?" I hesitated. The road looked rough, barely more than a track carved into the dirt, but it was the first sign of anything we'd seen in hours. "Let's try it," I said, turning the wheel. The dirt road was bumpy and uneven, the car rattling as we drove deeper into the plains. The landscape was strange, jagged rocks jutting out of the ground like teeth, with patches of dry, cracked earth in between. "This doesn't look very scenic," Rachel muttered, glancing out the window. I nodded, gripping the wheel tightly. The road was getting narrower, the ruts deeper, and I had to slow down to keep from bottoming out. "I think we should turn around," Rachel said, her voice uneasy. Before I could respond, the car jolted violently, the back tire sinking into a deep rut. "Damn it!" I shouted, slamming on the brakes. We were stuck. We got out to survey the damage. The rear tire was buried in the dirt, the car tilted at an awkward angle. "This is great," Rachel said, crossing her arms. "Now what?" "I'll try to dig it out," I said, grabbing a small shovel from the trunk. As I worked, Rachel wandered a few feet away, scanning the horizon. "Do you hear that?" she asked suddenly, her voice trembling. I stopped digging, listening. At first, I didn't hear anything. But then it came, a low, rumbling sound, faint but growing louder. "What is that?" I whispered, my chest tightening. The rumbling grew louder, the ground vibrating beneath our feet. Rachel grabbed my arm, her nails digging into my skin. "Jack, what's going on?" I didn't answer. I was too focused on the horizon, where a dark shape was rising from behind the rocks. It moved slowly at first, its massive body blending into the dusty landscape. But as it got closer, I realized what I was looking at. It wasn't a car or a machine. It was an animal. The creature was enormous, its scaly body covered in rough, cracked skin that matched the rocky terrain. Its head was long and narrow, with sharp teeth that glinted in the sunlight. "Oh my God," Rachel whispered, taking a step back. "Is that a dinosaur?" I couldn't speak. The creature's glowing eyes locked onto us, and it let out a low, guttural growl that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. "Get in the car," I said, my voice shaking. Rachel didn't argue. We scrambled back into the car, slamming the doors shut just as the creature stepped closer, its massive claws digging into the dirt. I turned the key, praying the engine would start. It sputtered once, then roared to life. "Thank God," I muttered, throwing the car into reverse. The tires spun uselessly in the dirt, the car lurching but not moving. "It's stuck," Rachel shouted, her voice rising. The creature roared, its massive tail whipping through the air as it charged toward us. I floored the gas, the car jerking forward as the tires finally found traction. We sped down the dirt road, the creature close behind, its footsteps shaking the ground. "Go faster," Rachel screamed, clutching the dashboard. "I'm trying," I shouted, gripping the wheel tightly. The road was rough and uneven, the car bouncing wildly as I swerved to avoid rocks and holes. The creature roared again, its massive jaws snapping just a few feet behind us. We reached the highway and swerved onto the pavement, the tires screeching as I gunned the engine. For a moment, I thought we were safe. But then I saw it in the rearview mirror. The creature was still chasing us, its massive body barreling down the road like a freight train. "It's not stopping," Rachel shouted, her voice breaking. "Neither am I said, pressing the pedal to the floor. The car was barely holding together, the engine whining as we pushed it to its limit. The creature let out another roar, its glowing eyes locked onto us as it gained ground. "Jack, do something!" Rachel screamed, tears streaming down her face. I spotted an overpass up ahead, a narrow tunnel carved into the side of a hill. "Hold on!" I shouted, swerving toward it. We shot into the tunnel, the creature's roar echoing behind us. For a moment, everything was dark, the only sound the pounding of my heart. Then, there was a deafening crash as the creature slammed into the side of the tunnel, its massive body too big to fit through. The car skidded to a stop, and we sat there in stunned silence, gasping for air. "Is it gone?" Rachel whispered. I didn't answer. I didn't know. We waited for hours before daring to drive out of the tunnel. The highway was empty, the creature nowhere in sight. We didn't stop until we reached the next town, where we abandoned the car and caught a bus home. Rachel and I never talked about what happened that day. But sometimes, late at night, I dream about the highway. And I know it's still out there, waiting for someone else to take the scenic route. I never thought I'd miss the city. When my parents decided to sell our house and move out to the country, I thought it would be cool. They bought an old farm with a huge barn, acres of land, and even a little creek that ran along the edge of the property. "It's a fresh start," my dad said, smiling as he loaded the last box into the moving truck. I was 14 at the time, and I thought it sounded like an adventure. No neighbors, no noise, and plenty of space to do whatever I wanted. But I didn't know what waited for us out here. The first few weeks on the farm were fine. I spent most of my time exploring the property, riding my bike along the dirt trails and climbing the big oak tree in the front yard. There wasn't much to do, but I didn't mind. It was peaceful, and the sunsets were amazing. But then I started hearing the noises. It was late one night, after my parents had gone to bed. I was in my room, scrolling through my phone, when I heard it, a low, rumbling growl, coming from somewhere outside. At first, I thought it was just the wind, or maybe a coyote. But the sound was deeper than that, almost like the purr of a giant cat. I got up and looked out the window, my breath fogging up the glass. The yard was empty, the moonlight casting long shadows across the grass. I told myself it was nothing and went back to bed. But I didn't sleep much that night. The noises came again the next night, and the night after that. They always started around midnight, low and rumbling at first, then growing louder, like whatever was making them was getting closer. I told my dad about it, but he just laughed. "It's probably just a raccoon or a stray dog," he said, ruffling my hair. "Nothing to worry about." But I wasn't so sure. One afternoon, I decided to check out the barn. It was old and falling apart, the red paint peeling off the walls and the roof sagging in the middle. My parents had talked about fixing it up, but they hadn't gotten around to it yet. The inside was dark and musty, the air thick with the smell of hay and rotting wood. I wandered around for a while, kicking at the piles of debris and peeking into the stalls. That's when I saw it. At first, I thought it was just a rock. It was half buried in the dirt, its surface smooth and gray. But when I knelt down to get a closer look, I realized it wasn't a rock at all. It was a tooth. A massive tooth, as long as my hand and sharp enough to cut through flesh. I stared at it, my stomach twisting. "What the hell?" I whispered, picking it up. The tooth was heavy and cold, and as I turned it over in my hands, I noticed something else. There were more of them. I spent the rest of the afternoon digging through the dirt, uncovering a pile of bones that looked like they belonged in a museum. Some were small, like ribs and vertebrae, but others were massive, skulls with long, curved teeth and claws that looked like they could tear through steel. I didn't know what kind of animal they came from, but I knew one thing: they didn't belong here. That night, the noises were louder than ever. I sat by the window, clutching the tooth in my hand, as the growls echoed across the farm. The sound wasn't just coming from one spot anymore. It was everywhere, circling the house, moving through the yard, and rattling the windows like some kind of invisible storm. I wanted to wake my parents, but something told me it wouldn't matter. Whatever was out there, it wasn't afraid of us. The next morning, I found the tracks. They were in the dirt near the barn, massive clawed footprints that sank deep into the ground. I followed them for a while, my heart pounding as they led me toward the creek at the edge of the property. The water was still and dark, the trees on the other side casting long shadows across the bank. The tracks disappeared into the creek, the mud churned up like something had crawled out of it. I turned and ran back to the house, my chest tight with fear. I tried to tell my parents, but they didn't believe me. Dinosaurs, my dad said, laughing. Come on, Sam. You've been watching too many movies. I'm serious. I shouted, slamming the tooth onto the kitchen table. Look at this. My mom frowned, picking it up. Where did you find this? In the barn, I said. There's a whole pile of bones out there. She sighed, shaking her head. It's probably just from an old cow or something. This is a farm, after all. But I could see the doubt in her eyes. That night, I stayed awake, listening to the growls as they grew louder and louder. Around midnight, I heard something else, a loud crash, followed by the sound of splintering wood. I jumped out of bed and ran to the window, my hands shaking. The barn was collapsing, the walls buckling as something massive tore through them. In the moonlight, I saw it. It was huge, its scaly body covered in dark green skin that shimmered in the faint light. Its head was long and narrow, with rows of sharp teeth that glinted as it roared. A dinosaur. I stumbled back from the window, my heart racing. Mom! Dad! I shouted, running down the hall. They met me in the living room, their faces pale as the growls shook the house. What's happening? My mom whispered. Before I could answer, the front door burst open. The creature stepped inside, its massive claws sinking into the wooden floor. It roared, the sound so loud it made my ears ring, and I grabbed my parents, pulling them toward the back door. Run! I shouted, shoving them outside. We sprinted across the yard, the creature's footsteps shaking the ground behind us. When we reached the creek, I turned to see it charging toward us, its glowing eyes locked onto me. Go! I shouted, pushing my parents across the water. I don't remember much after that. The next thing I knew, I was lying on the ground, the sun rising above the trees. The barn was gone, reduced to a pile of rubble, and the creature was nowhere in sight. My parents said it must have been a dream, that the barn had collapsed on its own. But I know what I saw. And I know it's still out there, waiting for someone else to wake it up. It was supposed to be a fun night. There's this old, abandoned amusement park a few miles outside of town. People used to say it was haunted or cursed or whatever, but my friends and I never believed any of that. When Sarah suggested we check it out, it sounded like a cool idea. It'll be creepy, she said, grinning as she handed me a flashlight. Like something out of a horror movie. I should have said no. But I didn't. We met up just after sunset, 5 of us crammed into Sarah's old hatchback. The park had been closed for years, the gates rusted shut and the rides slowly crumbling under layers of graffiti and vines. Look at this place, Mike said, leaning out the window as we pulled up. It's awesome. It's a dump, I muttered, though I couldn't help but feel a little excited. It was the kind of place you'd see in a horror movie, dark, eerie, and totally abandoned. Or so we thought. The main gate was chained shut, but someone had cut a hole in the fence nearby. See? People come here all the time, Sarah said, ducking through the gap. I followed her reluctantly, my flashlight cutting through the shadows as we made our way inside. The park was even creepier up close. The Ferris wheel loomed above us, its skeletal frame creaking in the wind, while the carousel sat frozen in time, its once bright horses now faded and peeling. This is so cool, Mike said, snapping pictures with his phone. Yeah, I said, glancing around. Cool. But something about the place felt wrong. We wandered through the park for a while, climbing onto broken down rides and joking about how haunted it was. Sarah wanted to check out the old funhouse, so we headed that way, cutting through a maze of rusted booths and overturned trash cans. That's when I noticed the smell. It was faint at first, like rotting meat, but it grew stronger the closer we got to the funhouse. "Do you guys smell that?" I asked, wrinkling my nose. "Probably just a dead animal," Sarah said, shrugging. I wasn't so sure. The funhouse was in worse shape than the rest of the park. The front door had fallen off its hinges, and the colorful paint was peeling away to reveal the bare wood underneath. "Let's go in," Sarah said, grinning. "I don't think that's a good idea," I said, glancing at the dark entrance. "Don't be such a baby," Mike said, pushing past me. "It's just an old building." Reluctantly, I followed them inside. The air was thick and musty, the faint smell of mildew mixing with that awful rotting stench. Our flashlights barely cut through the darkness, the beams bouncing off warped mirrors and broken glass. "This place is disgusting," Emma said, stepping over a pile of rubble. "Yeah, but it's kind of cool," Mike said, snapping more pictures. I was about to tell him to put his phone away when I heard it. A low, rumbling growl. "Did you hear that?" I whispered, my chest tightening. "Hear what?" Sarah asked, glancing over her shoulder. Before I could answer, the growl came again, louder this time. It sounded like it was coming from deeper inside the funhouse, somewhere past the maze of mirrors. "We should go," I said, my voice shaking. "Come on," Mike said, rolling his eyes. "It's probably just an animal." But it didn't sound like an animal. We followed the sound, winding through the narrow halls of the funhouse. The growling grew louder with every step, echoing off the walls and making my skin crawl. "I don't like this," Emma said, gripping my arm. "Relax," Mike said, though his voice wasn't as confident as before. We turned a corner and entered a large, open room. And that's when we saw it. At first, I thought it was a statue. It was massive, its body hunched over in the middle of the room, with jagged claws and rough, scaly skin that shimmered in the light of our flashlights. But then it moved. Its head jerked up, and two glowing eyes locked onto us. "Oh my God," Sarah whispered, her voice barely audible. The creature let out a low, guttural growl, its teeth glinting as it opened its massive jaws. "Run," I said, my voice trembling. We turned and bolted, our footsteps echoing through the funhouse as the creature roared behind us. The ground shook with every step it took, the walls rattling as it crashed through the narrow halls. "This way," Mike shouted, leading us down a side corridor. The passage was tight, the walls closing in around us as we scrambled over debris and broken glass. I could hear the creature getting closer, its growls turning into deafening roars. We burst out of the funhouse and into the open air, gasping for breath. But the creature didn't stop. It crashed through the entrance, its massive body splintering the wooden frame as it lunged toward us. "Keep running," Sarah shouted, grabbing my arm. We sprinted toward the Ferris wheel, the sound of the creature's footsteps shaking the ground behind us. "This way," Emma yelled, pointing to a cluster of old carnival booths. We ducked behind the booths, crouching low as the creature roared again. For a moment, everything was quiet. I held my breath, my heart pounding as I listened for any sign of movement. Then, I heard it, a low, snuffling sound, like the creature was searching for us. "It's close," Mike whispered, his face pale. I nodded, gripping the edge of the booth. The creature let out another roar, and I peeked around the corner, my stomach twisting as I saw it tearing through the booths just a few feet away. "We need to move," I whispered, glancing at Sarah. She nodded, her eyes wide with fear. We made a break for it, sprinting across the park toward the main gate. The creature roared, its massive claws tearing into the ground as it chased after us. "Go, go, go!" Sarah shouted, her voice breaking. We reached the fence and scrambled through the gap, the metal tearing at our clothes as we squeezed through. The creature stopped at the edge of the park, its glowing eyes watching us as we collapsed on the other side. For a moment, it just stood there, its massive body silhouetted against the moonlight. Then, it turned and disappeared into the shadows. We didn't talk much on the drive home. No one would believe us if we told them what happened, and none of us wanted to go back to the park to prove it. But sometimes, late at night, I hear that growl again in my dreams. And I know it's still out there, lurking in the ruins of the old amusement park, waiting for someone else to stumble into its territory. I wasn't supposed to be in the forest that night. My cousin Liam and I had made a pact when we were kids. Every summer, no matter what, we'd spend at least 1 week at my grandparents' cabin in the woods. It didn't matter how busy we were or how far apart we lived, we'd always find a way to make it happen. But this summer felt different. The cabin had been empty for months since my grandparents moved to a retirement home, and the woods felt off. Like they were holding a secret they didn't want anyone to know. "Come on, Sophie," Liam said, tossing a flashlight at me. "It's our tradition. What's the worst that could happen?" I didn't have an answer. But something about the way the trees seemed to sway, even though there wasn't any wind, made me hesitate. We got to the cabin late in the afternoon, the sky a dull gray as storm clouds gathered on the horizon. "Feels like rain," I said, stepping out of the car. "Perfect," Liam said, grinning as he slung his backpack over his shoulder. "Makes the woods creepier." I rolled my eyes but followed him inside. The cabin smelled like dust and old wood, the air thick and stale after months of being closed up. We opened the windows to let in some fresh air, then sat down to plan our trip. "We should hike to the clearing tomorrow," Liam said, spreading out an old map on the table. I nodded. The clearing was our favorite spot, an open patch of grass surrounded by tall pines, with a stream running through the middle. But as I looked at the map, my stomach twisted. The clearing was marked with a red X, but there was something written next to it in tiny, faded letters. "Stay out." "Did you write this?" I asked, pointing to the map. Liam frowned, shaking his head. "Nope." It must have been Grandpa. I stared at the words, my chest tightening. Why would he write that? Who knows? Liam said, shrugging. Maybe it was a joke. I didn't think it was a joke. The storm hit that night, the wind howling through the trees and rain lashing against the windows. I lay awake in my bunk, listening to the storm and trying to shake the uneasy feeling that had been growing in my chest since we arrived. Around midnight, the wind died down, leaving the cabin eerily silent. Then, I heard it. A low, rumbling growl, coming from somewhere outside. I sat up, my heart pounding. "Liam," I whispered, shaking his shoulder. He groaned, rolling over. "What? Did you hear that?" He frowned, sitting up and rubbing his eyes. "Hear what?" The growl came again, louder this time. Liam froze, his eyes wide. "What the hell is that?" "I don't know," I whispered, grabbing my flashlight. We crept to the window, our breaths fogging up the glass as we peered into the darkness. At first, I didn't see anything. But then, just beyond the tree line, I saw it. The tracks. Massive, three-toed footprints, pressed deep into the mud. "What the hell made those?" Liam whispered, his voice trembling. I shook my head, my stomach twisting. The growl came again, and I saw something move between the trees, a shadow, long and sinuous, with glowing eyes that seemed to pierce through the darkness. "Close the curtains," Liam whispered, backing away from the window. I didn't argue. We stayed up the rest of the night, huddled on the couch with our flashlights clutched in our hands. The growls came and went, echoing through the forest like the calls of some ancient predator. By the time the sun rose, we were both exhausted, our nerves frayed from hours of listening to the strange sounds outside. "We need to check the clearing," Liam said, his voice hoarse. "Are you crazy?" I said, glaring at him. "Something's out there." "That's why we need to see it," he said, grabbing his backpack. "What if it's, I don't know, something no one's ever seen before?" I wanted to argue, but I knew it was pointless. Liam wasn't going to back down. We set out later that morning, following the old trail that led to the clearing. The forest was eerily quiet, the usual sounds of birds and insects replaced by an oppressive silence. I kept my flashlight in my hand, even though the sun was shining, and my eyes darted to every shadow that moved between the trees. "Relax, Sophie," Liam said, though he didn't sound as confident as usual. I didn't respond. When we reached the clearing, I stopped in my tracks. The grass was trampled, the earth torn up as if some massive creature had been there. In the center of the clearing was a pile of bones, ribs, skulls, and vertebrae, all jumbled together in a massive heap. "What the hell is this?" I whispered, my chest tightening. Liam crouched down, picking up a massive claw that looked like it belonged to a dinosaur. "This is insane," he said, grinning. "Do you know what this could mean?" "I know it means we need to leave," I said, grabbing his arm. But before we could move, the growl came again. It was louder this time, so deep it made the ground vibrate beneath our feet. Liam and I froze, our eyes locking. "Run," he whispered. I didn't need to be told twice. We sprinted back toward the trail, our footsteps pounding against the dirt as the growls grew louder behind us. I could hear something crashing through the trees, its massive footsteps shaking the ground. "Don't look back," Liam shouted, his voice rising. But I couldn't help myself. It was huge, its scaly body covered in dark green skin that shimmered in the dappled sunlight. Its head was long and narrow, with sharp teeth that gleamed as it roared, its glowing eyes locked onto me. "A dinosaur," I whispered, my chest tightening. I turned and ran, my lungs burning as I pushed myself to keep up with Liam. "We're almost there," he shouted, pointing to the cabin in the distance. The creature roared again, its massive claws tearing into the ground as it charged after us. We burst through the cabin door and slammed it shut, our chests heaving as we leaned against it. The growls echoed outside, followed by the sound of something massive circling the house. "What do we do?" I whispered, my voice trembling. Liam didn't answer. He was staring at the window, his face pale. The creature was outside, its glowing eyes watching us through the glass. It didn't leave until morning. By the time the sun rose, the growls had stopped, and the forest was silent again. We packed up our things and left without looking back, our nerves shot and our hearts still racing. No one believed us when we told them what happened. But I know what I saw. And I know it's still out there, waiting in the forest for someone else to find its tracks. I didn't want to spend the summer at the lighthouse. When my uncle broke his leg, my mom volunteered me to help him out. He lived by himself, managing an old lighthouse on a remote stretch of coastline. No Wi-Fi, no cell service, just miles of cliffs and crashing waves. "You'll love it," Mom said as she shoved my suitcase into the trunk. "It's peaceful." She had no idea what she was talking about. The first few days were boring. Uncle Carl spent most of his time in the lighthouse tower, checking the light and monitoring the weather. He tried to teach me how to read the old charts and logbooks, but I didn't really care. I spent my time wandering the rocky shore, picking up shells and skipping stones across the tide pools. It wasn't exciting, but it was better than sitting in the tiny cabin with nothing to do. That's when I found the tracks. They were in the sand near the edge of the cliffs, massive, three-toed footprints pressed deep into the ground. At first, I thought they were from some kind of bird, but they were too big, easily the size of a car tire. I knelt down, running my fingers along the edges of one of the prints. The grooves were deep, as if whatever made them was incredibly heavy. "Uncle Carl!" I shouted, waving toward the lighthouse. He hobbled down the hill on his crutches, frowning when he saw the tracks. "What do you think made these?" I asked, pointing to the prints. He didn't answer right away. Finally, he said, "There are stories about this place." "What kind of stories?" He shook his head. "It's probably nothing. Just some big bird or something." But I could tell he didn't believe that. That night, I couldn't sleep. The wind howled outside, rattling the windows, and the waves crashed against the rocks with a deafening roar. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, trying to ignore the uneasy feeling in my chest. Then I heard it. A low, rumbling growl, so deep it made the floorboards vibrate. I sat up, my heart pounding. "Uncle Carl?" I called out, my voice shaking. No response. The growl came again, louder this time, followed by the sound of something massive moving outside. I grabbed my flashlight and crept to the window, pulling back the curtain just enough to peek outside. The beach was empty, the moonlight casting long shadows across the sand. But then, just beyond the cliffs, I saw it. It was huge, its body hunched low to the ground as it moved along the shoreline. At first, I thought it was some kind of lizard, but it was too big, easily the size of a bus. Its skin was rough and scaly, and its long tail dragged behind it, leaving deep grooves in the sand. I froze, my breath catching in my throat as it turned its head toward the lighthouse. Its glowing yellow eyes seemed to pierce through the darkness, locking onto me for a split second before it let out another low growl. I stumbled back from the window, my hands shaking. "Uncle Carl!" I shouted, running to his room. He was sitting up in bed, his face pale. "You saw it, didn't you?" he said, his voice low. I nodded, my chest tight with fear. He sighed, rubbing his temples. "I was hoping the stories weren't true." "What stories?" I asked, my voice trembling. He hesitated, then said, "There's a reason this place is so isolated. People used to talk about strange creatures along this stretch of coast, things that didn't belong in this world. Most folks dismissed it as superstition, but what?" He looked at me, his eyes filled with fear. "Stay inside. No matter what you hear, don't go outside." I didn't sleep at all that night. The growls continued, echoing through the darkness, and every now and then, I'd hear the sound of something massive moving along the cliffs. By the time the sun rose, the tracks on the beach were gone, washed away by the tide. But the uneasy feeling in my chest didn't go away. The next day, Uncle Carl sent me to check the generator near the edge of the property. "Take the long way around," he said, his voice sharp. "Stay away from the cliffs." I nodded, grabbing my flashlight and heading out. The air was heavy and still, the usual sound of seabirds replaced by an eerie silence. When I reached the generator, I froze. The fence surrounding it was torn apart, the metal twisted and bent like it had been hit by a wrecking ball. And there, in the dirt, were the tracks. I ran back to the lighthouse, my heart racing. "Something's out there," I said, bursting through the door. Uncle Carl frowned, grabbing his crutches and hobbling to the window. He stared out at the cliffs, his face pale. "We need to lock everything down," he said finally. "Why? What's going on?" He didn't answer. That night, the growls came back, louder and closer than before. I sat by the window, clutching my flashlight, as the sound of something massive moving outside filled the air. "Do you see anything?" Uncle Carl asked, his voice trembling. I shook my head. "Not yet." Then, the light in the tower went out. Uncle Carl cursed, grabbing his crutches. The generator's down, he said, his voice sharp. I'm not going out there, I said, my chest tightening. We don't have a choice, he said. If the light stays off, the ship could crash. I hesitated, then grabbed my flashlight. Fine. But we're both going. The wind howled around us as we made our way to the generator, the beam of my flashlight barely cutting through the darkness. The growls were louder now, echoing off the cliffs like thunder. Hurry, Uncle Carl said, his voice shaking. When we reached the generator, I froze. The creature was there, its massive body hunched over the broken fence. It turned its head toward us, its glowing eyes locking onto mine, and let out a deafening roar. Run! Uncle Carl shouted, grabbing my arm. We stumbled back toward the lighthouse, the creature's footsteps shaking the ground behind us. I could feel its hot breath on my neck as we reached the door, slamming it shut just as it lunged. The walls rattled as it roared, its claws scraping against the wood. What do we do? I shouted, my voice breaking. Upstairs, Uncle Carl said, his face pale. We climbed to the top of the tower, locking the hatch behind us. The creature circled the lighthouse, its roars echoing through the night. I sat with my back against the wall, clutching my flashlight, as Uncle Carl stared out the window. It'll leave when the sun comes up, he said, his voice trembling. And if it doesn't? He didn't answer. The creature was gone by morning, but the damage it left behind was unmistakable. Deep claw marks in the walls, shattered windows, and torn up ground near the cliffs. Uncle Carl didn't say much as we packed up our things and left the lighthouse. When I asked if he'd ever come back, he just shook his head. No one should.